We're now live, it seems. And the first
Awesome.
thing I'd like to do is to warn everyone that this stream is the first LinkedIn Live for me. I'm very blessed to have my friend David De Jesus. That's the Latin American in me coming out. I want to welcome him. He is a venture capital VC, but he started off his career as a developer. He's now also a startup advisor. David, welcome.
Thank you, Christian.
How are you doing today?
I'm great.
Awesome. So how are things going at your home at the moment? Let's get that out of the way.
It's good. I have a little patio that we could do workouts on and stay active. But other than that, I'm pretty used to being at home and taking calls at home. Yeah.
Very cool. Yeah. I'll be able to send you some videos of like yoga exercise. I think I've gone through the whole of YouTube by now.
Oh, I definitely have too. A funny thing is I started a startup called Physio.co, Fizio.co.
Mm-hmm.
And it was aggregating all the home workouts from YouTube, Instagram, and it was also grabbing podcasts and blogs. So they put it all in one place, and you can navigate it through different modalities. Like I'm a runner, I'm a yoga, practitioner, things like that. But that was another startup that I started, and it might still be alive, but
absolutely.
Very, very heavy.
So tell us a little bit about ViewFund. I know that you guys are a $100 million fund, and that you guys are, investing in several different verticals. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what you guys do, and then we'll jump into a big conversation about NoCode, because that's what we're here for.
Exactly. So VU Fund, VU stands for Venture University, and the program, it's actually an apprenticeship for VCs. This is a different kind of approach to VC, and it's the most scalable way to introduce people who are interested in institutional VC financing as an investor into the program. And so our fund itself is a $100 million fund, yes. And we invest in several verticals. So then that includes consumer, fintech, enterprise, frontier, and healthcare. And so we have an expansive team. It's usually about 35 people per quarter. And those 35 people will have different specialties, which adds to the value for entrepreneurs. And we make about 2 to 5 investments. Actually 5 investments last quarter, and we're looking for another 5 this quarter. And check sizes are about $250K to $1 million. And we're looking for some outstanding world-class companies, obviously. And it's a fun process. It's actually a really fun way to develop your mindset as an investor and create a thesis around the markets around us. VC investors are long, so we're long thinkers. Which kind of makes us a little bit stoic in from a certain extent, just because we're dealing with a pandemic. We understand that, but our fund, we're still writing checks. We're still looking for startups to support, and the best startups, come from very hard times, like in history. So, I'm excited about that opportunity to be able to support that.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, a lot of the startups that, like what you just mentioned, basically, like we saw amazing companies like Uber or Airbnb come from the 2007-8 crash. And I think that like through this crash as well, we're going to see a lot more. On one end, because we're seeing how volatile employment is in times like these, but in general, over like, a life cycle of a human being, like, so, there's going to be at least 1 to 2 crashes, and job security is kind of is not super high. But also because people start realizing like this might be a good time for me to learn new things and to start, actually building the things that I was always kind of dreaming of. So you see some of those like higher level people stepping into entrepreneurship world and like, starting off.
I think what we're looking for right now is meaningful companies because it comes down to the basics. And so when I say basics, it just means that, look, we're looking for companies that can address our basic human needs now. And that really purifies, the entrepreneurial approach. I think before, you could definitely bank on, features, band-aids, all the funny buzzwords, but companies were just getting funded with very little to show, and so we kind of saw that as a big economic churn with WeWork and other companies, backed by SoftBank. So, but still, when you look at kind of the total market, VC has always been historically the smallest percentage of the total market, but has the largest impact overall. And so,
Yeah.
the practice or the craft of VC is still long-standing, and historically, it's still going to prevail over all the other asset classes.
Yeah. So how do you think that this pandemic is going to really influence founders, right? And I'm sure, like, listen, it's definitely going to have a different toll on people at different phases. But what do you think some of the overarching things are going to be like? What do you predict? And yeah, I hear you about saying, we're VCs, we invest for 10 years. So having like a 6-month to 1-year pandemic is maybe something that will affect the next 5 years, but you're really investing in people who have a vision for 10 years.
Yeah, and actually, if you're an entrepreneur at this time or at times like this, it really does show that you're used to dealing with adversity, and you're used to dealing with kind of hardship, and that's one kind of factor that we look for in founders, and especially, I've looked at the some of the classes from WeAreNoCode, and mindset is a big thing, and so mindset and dealing with those types of adversities, especially global adversity and then internal adversity, if you can kind of focus that into your energy into a productive startup, that is a skill that we really look for. But you were actually asking about strategies. I think there's different VCs in different states. If you have a big, strong portfolio company, your job right now as a VC is to support those portfolio companies. The layoffs are a big thing that we're seeing in the news. And so supporting those companies throughout a layoff strategy, or at least some type of methodology. One's called a lifeboat strategy. And your job right now is to thrive on the cash that you have and create some initiatives to make your company a little bit more resilient. And so that's another skill that we're kind of seeing with really skillful entrepreneurs and creativity. It's all about creativity at this point, and really dealing, with crisis, damage control. So those are kind of the strategies you have to think. And you kind of have that same saying, like wartime CEO versus peacetime CEOs, and the wartime CEOs are who kind of are thriving right now.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think for early stage entrepreneurship, like this just continues to reinforce, like, hey, you've got to really do the most with the least. And I think that's where, like, maybe we can transition into NoCode. But ultimately, like, it's always been the same game. Like, there's been this really big gap that started creating at the early stages of building startups. And you can't really expect to raise money, or at least to raise money from institutional investors, without having traction. And it leaves the kind of dilemma, like, who's paying for the testing, the validation, the building, and going out there and starting to sign on first customers. And I think that's where we can kind of transition into NoCode, because it's now, a better time than ever to start the earliest stages of your company. And I think that that's kind of important in a time like this, where people are really struggling. A lot of people are losing their jobs. And some people are thinking, like, okay, what am I looking to do? Like, they're taking a step back from the job they've kind of been doing automatically, and they're thinking, how can I get started? And would you agree that, like, basically this is a big thing that I always talk about, that, like, the average person who's working in a company, even if it's a tech company, is not necessarily the best equipped to build a startup. Like, you kind of start from scratch, and learning how to be kind of a multifaceted entrepreneur is very different than knowing how to run a department.
Yeah, I mean,
there is some overlap, I would say, but I think that's a big mistake that I see. The people who spend the most money, like they'll spend $500,000 and not see real good results, are people who basically have the means, so they try to solve things by throwing money at it. But the reality is that, like, you have to go in, you have to learn the hard things, you have to do you have to go and do the hard work, basically.
Yeah,
you have to learn a lot of new areas.
Well, It's, I guess, a really interesting example right now that you're kind of touching on is people may be leaving the workforce, whether by choice or not by choice. And the thing is, people who have been living kind of in this flourishing and abundant, economy right now, may be propping themselves up on a lifestyle that they've reached, and they've reached an identity with their role and their salary.
Yeah.
And the thing that is wrong about that and transitioning into an entrepreneur is that you're going to be looking for some really shortfall wins and looking for, really fast money to prop yourself up on a lifestyle that you kind of created in a corporate life previously.
Yeah.
But that it doesn't take away, people have kids, people have responsibilities and financial, responsibilities. But again, when you are an entrepreneur and you're finding out that you have to dedicate a lot of your time into understanding your customer, understanding the value, that your company provides, it's going to take a lot of those resources and a lot of your time. And so there's a mystical or romanticized aspect of being an entrepreneur that can't do that. But also, I want to avoid people. I don't invest or won't invest in people who are just trying to exploit the current situation. Being exploitative is not the right investment at all. People who are building businesses aren't really, focusing on the current, where they're focusing on the forward-thinking idea. It's like people who are jumping on Zoom right now saying it's an incredible startup, but it's been around for 10 years. Same thing, and it's a public company. So it's interesting because people's attention gets pulled to what's current. What we want to do, or at least in general, is to educate the entire ecosystem and let them know that, look, you're building things for the future, not reactive to the current system or the current ecosystem.
Yeah. No, absolutely. That makes complete sense. Great. I think, and honestly, like I see other companies that are doing similar things that we were talking about. Like Teachable just got bought by a Brazilian company. They're like an online education platform. And it's kind of funny because people are just jumping on the short term.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, I think online education is only going to grow, especially with like schools going online and all that, and people getting more used to it. But it's interesting that, people are jumping on short-term opportunities, but then it's like, what does education look like 10 years from now? I think these bigger questions are super exciting, right?
Well, we haven't seen a lot of ed tech companies exit very well. And so the challenge with ed tech, and the reason it's interesting now, is that maybe these larger companies can find a way to advertise to kids or to parents, right? Mm-hmm. The go-to market strategies for these ed tech companies generally are, they're trying to reach an audience that they technically can't advertise to.
Yeah.
So there's a big disconnect in how those happen. But with the current situation, I would be interested to see companies who are kind of getting around that and being able to scale pretty rapidly.
Absolutely. Yeah. So let's go into kind of talking a little bit more specifically about NoCode. For people who don't really know what NoCode is, it's basically visual programming. So it's a way to build digital products and to automate systems without having to write any code. So tools that can allow you to build platforms like Twitter, Airbnb, Uber. I mean, a huge number of different solutions, productivity tools, et cetera, and go to market very quickly. So you don't actually have to learn how to code. The way that I sometimes describe it is like twofold. It's either a PowerPoint. You create a PowerPoint presentation where behind your PowerPoint there's fully functioning code and it's functional. And the other way I describe it is building blocks like Legos. So it's basically building blocks of code that you kind of mix and match so that you can create a fully new solution from what you're building. But I'd like to start off with a quote that's sort of Jason Calacanis. He talks about, so his quote is, "The promise of startups being able to get to year 2 with 250K in revenue without ever having a developer is the greatest unlock I can think of right now for our economy and for entrepreneurship." Mm-hmm. And so obviously, like a lot of people respect Jason. I think he's a great guy and everything he's doing with Launch too. But I think that we're really coming to a point at which there is a lot of misinformation about no code, and there needs to, and no code, in my opinion, and I think in a lot of other people's opinions, is the future, at least of the early stage. So why don't we start off by you telling us, because you have a very interesting story where you went from being a developer to being a no-coder. And that's not the typical thing that we see. A lot of people who are developers kind of hate against no-code because some people think it's going to take our jobs, we're going to be replaced, which is absolutely not the case. But why don't you tell us a little bit about your story and how you got there, how you went from being like, okay, I know how to code, but I'm going to use no code.
Yeah. Well, I think it comes in the shape of me running an agency for the last couple of years called augX, and we're, I positioned it, and our mission was to be kind of an augmentative, CTO to founders who are non-technical. But you realize that the majority of people, let me do a quick history though also. Let me pull back and do a quick history. The quick history is no-code's been around for a long, long time. So visual programming and using these tools and development tools have been around for a long time. However, with the same trajectory in parallel, developers have also been developing processes like agile, like really strong philosophies and design patterns around, really awesome code bases. And so you have really devout, developers who are strict to these things, and they really consider technical debt a bad thing. But that's not really addressing the problem. The problem that people have is that they think they need an app. So they think that people enter the market with a product that they've been spending money on and developing, and usually the cost is like 100 to 250K just in development costs, paying someone like myself, to develop the product kind of as a hired mercenary, without actually really understanding, your audience, the value proposition, the product design, from just understanding your user. And so the number one reason, according to CB Insights, that startups fail is that you built a product and it falls on, just shrugged shoulders, because you can't find that fit. If you have a great budget, that's one thing. And if you built a product and you have a great budget to go out and market it, that's a different kind of inflection point. But what we're talking right now is I serve a really, a clear audience, which is people that have no technical founders. And those founders are really smart, really driven, but essentially feel that they need something technical, a website, an app. And it's cheaper to really develop those things these days. But again, you're doing the process wrong. With no code and with the tools and platforms available, which I've been promoting heavily, such as Bubble, BuildBox. There's quite a few on the market, that in Webflow. These case studies are awesome when we look at them from an investor standpoint, because what you're trying to maximize in the early days of a startup, pre-revenue, is learnings per dollar. So when you look at learnings per dollar, how much did you learn about your customer? How much did you learn, at least, who that is, before you spent $1 on code?
Yeah, I love that. I love that thing about learnings per dollar. You can basically look at how long someone's been working at something, and then divide it by how much money they spent over that time. You get a very good idea. Yeah, I mean, honestly, it's also just on a larger level, like it's unlocking something much bigger, right? Which is the fact that we're going from, less than 1%, so it's 0.3% of people who know how to code, to now unleashing the opportunity for people who are non-technical, which represent, and obviously who have an internet connection and live in, which is basically 20, 30, 40%, to be able to now build digital tools and to learn that without having to spend 5 to 6 years on how to code. So for me, I kind of think that a lot of these platforms are really, really powerful, including Bubble and Webflow, which are the main things that we teach in WeAreNoCode. But I think there's also an increased opportunity in kind of targeting people who have the sales skills. I'm almost of the belief that building the product is not half the job. It's like a third of the job. The actual real hard thing is to bring that to market and to build a community around that of partners, of customers specifically, and eventually of investors and other people. But I think that the best way to get there is this mix between teaching people startup methodology. So that's like really something that for me over the past couple of years running an accelerator in LA has been very useful for. But then also teaching them the technical tools so that they suddenly can go about the earlier stages of testing and getting validation and getting first customers, break into revenue without having to hire expensive developers. And that's where I think that there's like this huge opportunity. If we think of like the generation maybe like 30 years ago, like being a sales guy was the best skill you could have to build a company. And I think we're going back to that. I think that we're slowly, as we empower more and more people who are non-technical, we're really moving back to this place where like you're going to have all these awesome people building startups. And I think me and you had a previous conversation where we talked about how there's so much amazing entrepreneurship creativity in other segments of the market, like not just business people, but like in people who are, you know, into cultural, like kind of the pop culture, right? So on my end, I can think of musicians who are incredibly creative and also have started adopting tech tools, and now giving them the opportunity to build tech tools is a whole new thing. You know, all these creative endeavors, artists, people in even people in sports like surfers, skaters, you know, all types of people basically who now have used their creativity in a certain way, and now they can kind of use that same creativity in building things and automating things, actually getting in touch with that digital era. So what are your thoughts about that? Like where could that go? What excites you about that?
I'm developing a thesis around this right now, and I have to give a credit to a guy named Webb Smith on the internet. But basically, you know, in the last 20, 30 years, like you mentioned, in the beginning, it was all about sales because, you know, technology was so expensive to develop. And then you got into this, this era, another era where it's like all about developers. And that was kind of Steve Ballmer's thing in Microsoft. And then in the next decade, you reached a point where you were like, oh, designers are the rock stars. You know, design, it's all about design, and you know, skeuomorphism kind of came out. And then, you know, then the next 10 years was all about STEM. Oh, all your kids need to learn STEM. They're going to be the new rock stars at you know, technical companies. I think right now in this new decade, what we're going to notice, especially, you know, it's been proven with the attention economy, is that people who know how to build an engaged audience, that skill set is what's going to make you the rock star. Obviously, you need an awesome team, but you know, I just got off the phone with some really great, you know, entrepreneurs with an accelerator recently, and they built a marketplace without ever having any technology. And that manual marketplace, in a manual sense, it just shows that you know, you can take those sales skills and those rock star kind of attitudes and build something from that. And the code is not a big thing. You can build platforms just as easy and quickly with no code. And so to kind of leave that in the back of your mind when you're building your company or your business, it allows you to really focus on the customer and engage your audience a lot more intensely, or with intent.
With intent, yeah. No, that's really interesting. I mean, you brought up some interesting points there. I think that right now we're like in this weird intersection where we kind of went through this whole phase, and I talk about like the older generation, like building really solid businesses, and that was like, okay, you're a sales guy, you're going to build a company that's money generating. And then we went into this, the opposite, right? It was like, no, let's just get active users, right? Let's like not even monetize. We'll just grow this thing out. And that obviously like got the attention of high growth investors. And then we started seeing a lot of overinflated companies, I'll say. And it's kind of a bubble, right? It's not really a bubble because there are definitely some great things that come from that. And there'll always be a place for that. But we lost the sense. And I think that like the newer generation since the past 1, maybe 2 decades, kind of went into this thinking of like, oh, I don't need to make any money. I just need to like build an app that everyone's going to use, right? And I think that now we're kind of like coming to this intersection where it's like you can't ignore one or the other. We are in a digital era where you need technology to build. Every business is a software business, and on the other side, like if you don't have any revenue, no one's going to be taking you seriously. So it's like let's now just leverage both sides. And I think we're coming to more healthy entrepreneurship right now. And I think that that is going to be, increasingly important within the realm of no code, because no code is really what allows people to do that with minimal resources. And that's what excites me about it. It's like, hey, how can we democratize? How can we put these tools and allow them to learn things in only a couple months, and not just how to build tools, but how to bring them to market. So that's my main focus with WeAreNoCode, is really that, and the no-code startup. But I think that there's increasing opportunity around things like that. There's also increased opportunity in the fact that the workforce is really shifting towards requiring everyone to have a certain level of digital skills, right? And so no code, and when we talk about no code, it's yes, you can build technologies, but you can also do things that are basically marketing and sales oriented. You can automate systems, and suddenly you can make one person worth like several people.
Yes.
So it's like we talk about a lot of jobs being taken over by machine learning, robotics, AI. And I think all that means is that now humans will have to learn how to use some of these tools to enhance their own personal skills and to leverage those as a way to be an extension of themselves, to be more productive, and not more productive in like the ones and zeros kind of game where like, oh, I have to do all these things manually, but leveraging something to do that hard work automatically. And you actually have to think your brain, like use your brain and use your creativity. So as humans, I think we're going to be using technology to in a way that's going to accelerate, growth, whether that's a sustainable thing or not, right?
I think you're touching on some really important things, because I'll start with one thing, which is I think people are definitely romanticizing the funding amounts that people receive. And they obviously, with the big investments and the big funds, those are definitely romanticized a lot. And I'll also kind of add on to that. But what part of my thesis is as well is, I think just an assumption, with all the tools out there, in this future, we're going to see, in the very near future, we're going to see a couple solopreneurs be $100 million companies. And that's going to be really odd in the face of what's happening in our economy. And the next thing that we're going to notice is that the rest of the world, the people who aren't solopreneurs, can be abundant entrepreneurs, because I think not every company needs to be VC backed. The customer should be just as romanticized as obtaining a funding amount. Yeah. And so part of my thesis as well is about reskilling. So reskilling the future and giving opportunities to people who haven't had exposure to digital, tools. Everyone's jumping on Zoom right now. So your tool sets it's kind of an interesting adoption curve right now, because everyone has to jump on some type of, tool. And so I can guarantee you that in the next 5 years or so, not so ed tech focused, but reskilling purposed. Just like WeAreNoCode, I think it's a great platform for just that same purpose, where I think a lot of people who haven't had exposure to the digital world may now kind of enter it with a low barrier, just so that we can get over that learning curve quickly.
Yeah, and we're actually we've developed the first partnership where we're giving access to the online accelerator course to people who don't have the means. So I think that's something I'm also very excited about. Like, what happens when you put an opportunity in front of someone who's never really been given one, and just see how they react to that. Because I think that there's so much value to be made. And when I say value, I'm talking about solving problems for people. And that, I think, is what I come back to every day with WeAreNoCode, is like, there's such a big disconnect between the technology and the human being, the average human being. Like, how can you narrow down that and how can you give access to kind of, I guess, like, create a bridge between that, on top of that gap, right? And I think that that's something that like a lot of no-code platforms who are teaching their own technologies, they get so much into the depth of every single bell and whistle. But the reality is that like it's an attention economy. If you're not able to keep people's attentions by really quickly bringing them to their end, like we're talking about changing human lives. We're not talking about just building technology, right? So that's where I think that as soon as we take a more human-centric approach to this whole thing, we're going to see the benefits on a social level, on an economic level. And I think right now this is going to be a big topic as we enter a massive global recession. I don't think we've ever reached, like usually it's like a recession kind of starts in one country and goes to other countries. Other countries feel the repercussions of that. But I don't think we've ever gone at the exact same time every economy goes into a complete plummet. So right now we're about to also deal with some really interesting new problems. And I think that on a more empathetic level, like one thing that's really difficult is like what's actually happening right now in terms of like so many people like losing their loved ones and all that. And I don't want to cast a shadow on that because that's really the center of the problem. I'm more talking about like what comes next. Like when we can start thinking about a next, like how can we start figuring out smart ways to improve for the next 10 to 20 years before the next recession.
Yeah. No, I honestly think I got a couple of responses to that. One portion is I think we also have to manage the expectation versus reality vortex, and that distortion, is a really important characteristic for good entrepreneurs. Like you need to be somewhat delusional and interesting. But again, also the expectation versus reality distortion also needs to be managed when people are just coming onto a technical platform. So people who are just for the first time learning something, you're not, maybe you will be, but you may not be the next Zuckerberg just by using one of these platforms. But the reality is you may have a problem that you're willing to spend some time and effort into solving, such as the supply chain issues with the medical preparedness, things that may be big issues in the future. Also, families and how families are now kind of interacting in a tighter kind of space. If you know how to analyze those problems and then create value around that, then easily you could come up with a solution that's technical. But it really starts with kind of having an expectation versus reality.
Yeah. But that's interesting what you say. Like you need like a realistic delusional. Like,
you need to be.
You need to like as an entrepreneur, you are jumping into the unknown, and like that is something that's scary, and you have to have a certain amount of optimism or at least belief in your vision. And that may be delusional or not, to be able to kind of like get this thing started and sacrifice a lot of things. And yeah, you talk about sort of like expectations. Like I think one of the big problems that's happening right now is that people are being promised by other people online that like, hey, like, you can sit on the beach in Mexico, do no work and get passive income, So there's a lot of like, of marketers out there that are promising this dream. And I think that it's important that everyone realize that no matter what you choose to do, and I'm not saying all these people have bad intentions, but basically it's going to take hard work. Like like there is no easy out, right? Like I've been in the game of entrepreneurship for 12 years. And I think one of the biggest things that was a pivotal moment for me was actually not when I sold my company, but when I actually failed the company and had to face myself, the depth of myself, and understand that that all this identity stuff and that like maybe my ego that was tied around this was a bunch of BS. And that, you just have to like engage in this idea of like, you know what, I might be not good at this because I'm trying it out. It's completely normal. But I know that if I put enough effort into it, I'm going to become good at anything. And I think that's where like engaging in the like mindset, I don't like that as a word because it's a bit fluffy. A lot of people use it bad. But I think like, actually believing in the fact that if you try to do things, and I'm not saying some people don't have natural skills and are kind of better to start off, but what I'm saying is that if you're willing to dedicate yourself to any craft for a certain amount of time, you will become incredibly good at it. And so that ability to be patient with yourself and to not be like, oh, I'm just like terrible at math. Like most people who say that, and that's a great example, or like is basically the fact that they had a bad experience with a math teacher, or maybe felt dumb in math class once because they were called out and they didn't know the answer.
Yeah.
And suddenly they have this way of interacting with math moving forward, which is like, not, I'm actually going to try to figure this out. It's like, oh, I freak out. No, I'm not good at math.
Yeah.
And so it's like, it kind of like, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, right?
Yeah.
So,
Once you put it out there, you're definitely going to be bad at math. But I think I loved the little portion about growth mindset, and Daniel Kahneman is probably the best economist that understands this, or at least puts it out there very well. But aside from mindset, and just in addition to that, it's like it's your belief system, but also I say this as an easy kind of like an easy way to consume it is really get in touch with your skill inventory and also know what your superpower is.
yeah,
Because people come from different backgrounds, and it's even the VC world is kind of leveling out in a way that's like cool. The pendulum's kind of swinging in a different direction, and VCs always knew that there was gaps in diversity and inclusion, but just didn't have a strategy or approach to it. And we also know that, look, I think the best entrepreneurs are just that much more aware of their superpowers. And it's not that you're not building a company on your superpowers. You're actually building a company on the fact that you can fill the gaps because you know your superpower so well. You can fill on your weaknesses.
yeah. And I think that's you're touching on something super important there. I hear so many people saying like, just know what you're good at and only do that. And I think that like, I'm also a big believer of like the obstacle is the way.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm a believer that like, know what you're good at and get increasingly good at that, but also like figure out what it's going to take, what things you would have to learn to be incredibly good and to get to your end, and slowly put time into those and get better and better and better. People
Mm-hmm.
talk about like, if you want to have a big audience, one thing that you have to start getting used to is this kind of thing, like getting in front of the camera. And at first, most people will be very uncomfortable in front of a camera. I mean, honestly, most of the time when I do shoots, for example, like it's me and the camera. It's like it's
Yeah.
not, you're not talking to a person. How do you portray the amount of sort of excitement that you have for your craft and all that through like a video screen when there's no one looking back at you, no one to talk to? It's difficult, and I think that that's something that like you basically find things that you suck at. Sorry for my swearing. And you basically are like, you know what? Okay, I need to put some time in this. Why? Because I know that I can't get this message out about no code and empowering people unless I get this skill down. So I still use my superpowers to do the things I do best and focus on those. But I also focus a lot of my energy on like, what are the things like no BS. What is it going to take to get this thing done? And then I look at those skills and I start learning them. And at first, I'm terrible at them, like everyone is at things that they don't know. And I think the ability to accept that as a human is completely counterintuitive to society. Society tells you you need to be good at things. You need to know things. Most founders get in front of VCs and have to act like they know everything, or they feel like they do. But also VCs love it when someone says, you know what? I hadn't actually thought of that. That's really interesting. Obviously not if it's a critical part of the business, but I think that there's a real value in showing that you're human, because these investors, these people who are going to back you, like they know the game way better than you usually. So it's like to being kind of honest around those things and being willing to continue to learn is just very powerful.
I think you kind of just said it there in a way that's interesting, because my natural tendency is, I'm going to go learn that. And then, my natural tendency is to go do that. But Calacanis actually says it too. And there's a few instances where when you're building a company and you're building a business, you also have to understand the opportunity cost. If you're going to go, like, if you don't have a designer, here's a great example. You're an entrepreneur, you don't have a designer. Are you going to spend the time to go learn to design and become a designer? Or are you going to leverage, the time, stay on your phone calls, stay on your strategy, stay on your top of your business, and hire someone that the best person you can for the dollar that you can, because you can't design, even though that designer might not be to the so-called standards that you think you have. But it's a really interesting evaluation of opportunity cost, because is your time as the CEO of your company meant to be in design? Because it's a 40-hour thing. Your 40 hours are probably better spent looking for funding, getting your strategy correct, getting your team together. So
like getting your first customer is probably
getting your first customer, right? And so the conversation, it's case by case. I think everything is case by case. But the one thing that I want to see out of this whole practice and endeavor in terms of no code and this being the entry point is that I want to see a family in the middle of America and who has not a lot of access to like Silicon Valley or exposure to Silicon Valley look at this opportunity and say, look, I can build a software company that can solve a problem, locally in my current region really, really well. That family, or at least even, the kids of that family, may then encourage other people in their community to start on this no code thing. What is this no code thing? Oh, I can come up with another solution. So that kind of snowball effect would actually take into place all these opportunities that were never there. They would create opportunities that were never there. That's the idea, and that's what I want to see with no code. And even in other countries where they're kind of emerging markets, like I want to see people address opportunities that were never there unless technology could come into play. And the other thing that I want to see is that maybe some of these companies may not be investable from a VC standpoint, but they may be able to grow the community in general of just the knowledge of being able to solve problems well.
And a solid business, frankly. That's why I always try to bring people back to like, okay, let's focus on building a business, and there are several paths you can take in doing that, right? And I think there's tremendous influence on kind of democratizing this early stage entrepreneurship and having people really understand it, because it's not that complicated. I think a lot of things that people make as a mistake is just to assume, oh, this is technical. This is, I'm not technical.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that to a certain extent is right, but at the same time, it's becoming so much easier that and the world is shifting in that direction. So the ability to kind of take this and run now is super important. And I think that within a couple of years, like right now, it's a competitive advantage. You learn no code, no question about it. You have a huge competitive advantage. You'll be able to, reskill yourself, build your own company, et cetera, et cetera. I think in 2 years, it'll probably be already part of the mainstream education system. It'll simply be the way that we teach people how to learn how to build products and work in the modern workforce.
So you talk about competitive advantage, and I think that's a big thing in VC is we, in terms of even investments. But I honestly think your competitive advantage is your superpower, and we have to really focus on that. And it's like the technology is becoming norm, right? So the technology is not standalone a competitive advantage, because if you can do it, I can do it, anyone can do it. It's not a competitive advantage, it's democratizing. However, the competitive advantage is truly, truly understanding your personal superpower and your ability to solve problems with that. And that's generally the best. Also, a little bit of branding sprinkled in doesn't hurt either. So
yeah.
I
love that. Cool. Well, David, thanks so much for coming on. Before I let you go, what can you tell us? Like maybe tell us what your influence. What kind of influence do you want to have in the world? What kind of mark are you looking to leave? I know this is a very sort of deep question, and I'm putting you completely on the spot here. But I'd love to, if there's one thing that can come to your mind, like what are some of the influences that you'd like to have in this world?
Well, I think my long-term goal is to build a world-class VC and be a world-class VC firm. But that means basically sticking to the science and craft of venture capital as a tool, investing in the best companies in the world. And what I mean by that is companies that have changed the fabric of our culture. They could be, the next TikTok or the next super app or mega app. But I'm looking for them. I'm looking for those companies. I'm looking for those founders. I'm looking for opportunities to, build the ecosystem here in LA, but also globally. But again, my long-term goal is to, really stick to the craft and keep investing in technologies that are coming down the road. So traction in terms of technologies is a, long-term thinking process. So we have to be really thinking long-term and make sure that those are kind of in line. And we can't really be really reactive to the current scenarios. We just have, as a system and as a tool in the capital system, this needs to be, thought of as a long-term focus.
I love that.
What I'm focused on. Yeah.
Love it. So where can people find you? You're on LinkedIn, David De Jesus.
Yeah, David De Jesus, investor, or just find me on LinkedIn, David De space Jesus. I'm also pretty active on LinkedIn, as that's my chosen platform to kind of put out. I put out free content, free links to investors and angel investors. I put out a lot of pop quizzes. In terms of founders, I like to put little VC quizzes on my LinkedIn, just so that you understand what VCs have to think about behind the scenes. And that information could be very valuable to founders, because you're not trying to think of consensus, but you're trying to develop your business so that you're in line with what's valuable from a VC standpoint.
Very cool. Well, thanks again for joining us. Very cool. I'm excited to continue conversation offline, maybe do another one of these soon on a different topic. Again, thanks so much for joining. Thanks for anyone who's listening now as well. This was my first LinkedIn Live. I'll be coming and doing this more often.
That was
David,
exciting. Thank you,
you're the best.
Yep.
See you soon.
Later, man.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.